So, what if the reasons men cheat are, well, a lot more about things like biology and insecurity than just a simple lack of love? In this explainer, we're going to move past the blame game and really break down the complex psychology behind infidelity. And honestly, some of the answers might really surprise you.
Yeah, this is the big one, right? It's the question that can absolutely tear relationships apart. But what our source material suggests is that the answer isn't just one single why. It's more like this tangled web of motivations. So we're going to unpack them, starting with what's actually going on inside the mind. Okay, first things first, we're going inside the man's mind. Before we even get into the relationship dynamics, we have to understand the internal drivers. The psychology, the personality, and even the biology that can set the stage for cheating in the first place. So we'll be looking at everything from psychological traits that, believe it or not, kind of crave chaos, to how a threatened ego can lead a guy to do some pretty desperate things. We're even going to touch on the surprising role our basic, hardwired biology plays in all of this. The source makes a really interesting point that for some people, cheating isn't really a symptom of a bad relationship at all. Nope. It's actually a feature of their personality. This constant need for the thrill of the chase, for emotional roller coasters, or just for a really raw, primitive kind of validation.
Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. You are doing important work.
But here's where it gets really interesting. We all know that stereotype of the player, right? But the data actually shows that this thrill-seeking type only accounts for about 15% of infidelity cases, which means for the other 85%, the reasons are way, way more complicated. All right, next up, we've got the wounded ego. Think about it. When a man feels like he's losing status or is constantly being challenged in his relationship, his whole sense of self can feel threatened. So in this context, cheating becomes less about pure desire and a lot more about escape. It's like a silent protest against the power dynamic at home. The source uses this quote that really captures the paradox. A woman wants to feel safe behind a strong wall, yet she constantly tries to break it down. This is all about that dynamic where a man feels his strength is constantly being tested, and if he feels like he's failing that test, well, his ego might just lead him to find validation somewhere else, somewhere he can feel strong again. Now, this might sound a lot like the wounded ego, but the motivation here is totally different. This isn't about escaping a problem, it's about actively trying to prove something. For a man with a really fragile self-esteem, having multiple affairs can become a way to silence that nagging internal voice of doubt, to prove to himself over and over again that he's still desirable, that he's still powerful. So, to put it really simply, the action kind of tells the whole story. The wounded ego? That leads to avoidance, basically running away from conflict. But self-assertion leads to a proactive search for reassurance, actively seeking out new encounters just to feel whole. Okay, let's switch gears for a second from psychology to pure biology. And this statistic, it's pretty staggering. According to the source, 9 out of 10 men report a really significant shift in how they feel about a partner after a certain amount of time passes. So what on earth is going on here?
Well, it's linked to what you could call our biological clock for infatuation. As you can see on this timeline, that initial super intense hormonal drive, it's basically wired to last about 3 to 5 years. And from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. It's just long enough for a child to be born and get a little more independent. But after that biological program fades, instinct can give way to a wandering eye, and the relationship has to survive on conscious choice and shared values alone.
So we've seen what can happen inside a guy's head. But of course, nobody exists in a vacuum. So now we're going to look at how the dynamic between two people can create these little cracks in the foundation of a relationship, creating the very distance that allows infidelity to creep in. We're going to examine 4 pretty common pressure points where that connection in a relationship can really start to fray, sometimes opening the door to an affair. The arrival of a newborn is like the classic stress test for any couple. A woman's focus naturally and rightly shifts to the child. But a man who isn't emotionally mature enough to make that crucial switch from being the center of attention, a son, to being a provider, a father, he can feel abandoned. And then he might start looking for that lost attention somewhere else. And of course, sometimes the reasons are, well, exactly what they look like on the surface. A mismatch in sexual needs or a relationship that's just fallen into a rut without any new experiences. That can easily lead one partner to seek that excitement and fulfillment outside the relationship. It happens. And then there's the search for a new love. This is what happens when the main relationship has just become a habit totally devoid of any real emotion. An affair in this case isn't just about sex. It's about finding that feeling of being in love again, which, let's be honest, is often a step toward leaving the relationship entirely. All right, we've looked inside the mind, we've looked inside the relationship. For our final section, we're going to zoom out even further and look at external triggers, these really powerful forces from the past and present, things like learned childhood behaviors, impulsive reactions, and sometimes just plain old circumstance. These last three reasons really show how infidelity isn't always some long, drawn-out, planned decision. Sometimes it's just a reaction to past trauma or to triggers happening right now. Okay, this one's huge. A man who grew up watching his own father be unfaithful has had that behavior hardwired into his brain as a relationship model. The source really stresses this. Even if he hated seeing it as a kid, that deeply learned pattern is incredibly difficult to break as an adult. And the statistic here it's just startling. The source claims there's an 85% chance that a man will repeat his father's pattern of infidelity. It just goes to show how deeply those childhood models get ingrained in our subconscious. And finally, there's what you could call reactive cheating, which can show up in a few different ways. It might be preemptive, driven by this deep fear of being cheated on first. Or it could be pure retaliation, a direct and often very open act of revenge after being hurt. And then there's just a moment of weakness, the right person, the wrong time, and a bad decision that is almost always followed by some pretty intense regret. So after exploring all these different motivations, from internal psychology to external triggers, what's the big picture here? What are we supposed to take away from all this? And this really brings us to the most important point. There's almost never a single reason. Infidelity is rarely a simple choice. It's a complex web. It's where a man's personal insecurities might intersect with relational boredom, and then bam, a sudden circumstantial opportunity pops up. The real story is never in just one of those threads, but in how they all weave together. And that leads us with one last question to think about. If we can move past simple judgment and really try to understand this complex web of causes, does that change how we talk about and maybe even how we prevent infidelity? It's definitely something to think about.
Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you want to overcome betrayal, break toxic cycles, take control of your relationship choices, read How to Deal with a Love Triangle. The link is below the video.